I'm here with my good friend Steve Hammer. Actually, he's in his studio in California, but we're sharing a screen and sharing a moment of gossip here. It's really nice to see you, Steve. Welcome.
Great to see you. It's been a
Um,
long time.
can you tell us a little bit about, I don't know, how you got started in music and how you sort of came across or discovered or turned over to the dark side of this early music business?
I went to Oberlin College. I was not a music major, but had been taking lessons with Jim Caldwell, uh, husband of Kathy Mines, who I think you also spoke with. Um, Wonderful player and also a very enthusiastic and proficient gamba player. Um, and
Your lessons were on the oboe and not the gamba.
Sorry.
You studied oboe,
I
right?
studied oboe
Right. Yeah.
with Jim, yes. Um, and I graduated and had been convinced, mostly because playing the oboe made sense to me for the first time, studying with Jim, that was what I wanted to do. So, for no particular reason, I moved to Boston and started driving a cab and looking for work and started playing with the Harvard Summer School Orchestra. Um, and I believe the conductor of that was a guy named Jerry Moschel, who recommended me to Tom Kelly, who was setting up I believe, a 17th Century Day concert in Ipswich, Massachusetts, at Castle Hill. Um, this was a modern instrument thing, and I played that and always liked Baroque music. And wasn't having a lot of luck finding work in Boston. So I was messing around with different things, and somebody had this funny looking oboe that turned out to be a copy of a classical oboe, except I didn't know that. It had two keys and nicely made, sounded horrible. So I was trying to put a modern read on it and play this thing. And I was corresponding with Jimmy at the time, and he said, "Oh, I'm starting a Baroque Performance Institute at Oberlin. Why don't you come to that?"
And we're talking about 1972 or 3 at this point, right?
That was 1973. I didn't actually get to BPI until 74. I took my Blackwood oboe, and Michel Piguet was teaching, and he took a look at it and handed it back to me and said, "It will make a nice lamp." And then he lent me an instrument, or actually the Oberlin Conservatory lent me an instrument, and I discovered it was something that I always like to tinker with things and get them working. And the thing to remember is nobody really knew what they were doing in those days. We were using all kinds of uh, contraptions and different sizes cane, different size tubes. There weren't any surviving Baroque oboes, so people were just kind of making up as they went along. Um, Michel had a system that he used kind of a modern oboe d'amore top, and it didn't play high notes, so he'd taken his original Rottenberg oboe and drilled a hole in the back to make a kind of an octave register key to make it play. And this embarrassed him later, so he filled it in and didn't tell anybody. But a lot of the records he made in the 60s were made using this thing to get the high notes to speak. So it was really very primitive. And so I went to BPI, came back and hooked up with Gene Lamont and Sarah Cunningham, who were also living in Boston at the time. Uh, and along with Robert Hill, we formed a enterprise called the Mayflower Baroque Ensemble. This was my first professional gig on Baroque oboe. Um, and this fellow named Fenton Hollander had an enterprise called the Concert Cruise, and they would go around, cruise around Boston Harbor, and there was chamber music. So Gene, and sometimes Sarah and Robert Hill and John Tyson and I. John Tyson was a recorder player, would play these Telemann things with the seagulls flying overhead and the diesel engines chugging away. And that was my introduction to Baroque performance. I'm sure we sounded ghastly, but the seagulls and engines kind of drowned it out. So this was around the time we were ramping up to the bicentennial of the U.S. So John had found a anthology of bicentennial 1776-ish music, and we chose our theme song, which was called the Boston March, and we would always start and end our cruises with that piece. So around that time, Tom Kelly was starting, I think, what was that, 74?
74.
When we started using period instruments for the first time. And we did in this barn, we got up to 130 degrees. And again, I'm sure it sounded dreadful.
Thank you.
No, we sounded dreadful. You were magnificent.
Yeah.
But the nice thing is we were kind of able to experiment and learn on the job and get paid for it. And by 76 or 77, I was able to stop driving taxis and was making a living and making it up as I went along, which was the wonderful advantage that we had at that time, was that nobody knew what they were doing, and everybody kind of was patient and tried to figure it out, and the audiences claimed they were patient anyway. And there was kind of a pioneering feeling to it. What else?
Well, and you began to work with other ensembles too. It was sometime around then that the Handel and Haydn Society switched over to Baroque instruments. Isn't that right?
Well, that was considerably later. They hired Chris Hogwood in 1986.
Oh, I thought it was in the 70s. No, it's not till the 80s.
Yeah, before that, there was a group called Banchetto Musicale in Boston, directed by Marty Perlman, which is now called Boston Baroque and is still going.
Yep.
I think that started around that time. They added oboes around 76, and Ken Roth and I were the first pair of oboes. We made a record of Telemann suites that still sounds pretty good. It's remarkable.
And you began to, when did you begin working also in New York?
Well, around that time, there were Chris Hallwood's predecessor at Handel and Haydn.
Thomas Dunn
is a name we don't hear very much now. Tommy Dunn had actually studied harpsichord with Leonhardt in Amsterdam and was very much up on period style as it was understood. And of course, they were metamorphosing at that point. Wasn't too long before that. What he'd studied in the 50s, but in the 60s, Leonhardt and Jaap Schroeder and Bruggen and who am I leaving out?
Sigiswald Kadkin, others.
The Quadro Amsterdam, of course. Did I say him?
Yes.
We're switching over from modern instruments to period instruments and changing their style completely. This was kind of the origin of the lingua franca. If you listen to their records from the late 60s compared to their records of the late 70s, mid to late 70s, they're very different in style. There's this very rhetorical, gestural style, and Leonhardt was pretty much responsible for that. But meanwhile, in this country, Tommy Dunn won every honor at the Amsterdam Conservatory that you could get. They thought he was wonderful. He was a conductor and an organist and a harpsichordist. And he came back and started a group called Festival Associates in the 60s. and did a lot of the repertoire that we do now. He did Messiah, Acis and Galatea, the Bach Passions, the B minor Mass, um, and he regretted that period instruments didn't sound good enough to be in Carnegie Hall yet at the time.
And I
So
think
he
he was
used,
right. He was actually right, wasn't he?
yeah, he was definitely right. While we were honking and squeaking in the barn at Castle Hill, he was doing these concerts in Carnegie, and then Philharmonic Hall, which became Avery Fisher Hall, which now is called something else again, isn't it?
David Geffen Hall now. Yeah.
That's right. Um, but a lot of the repertoire and the idea of smaller forces were there, and a lot of the people that he was using later took up period instruments. John Solon was his flute player. Stan Ritchie played violin for him. Albert Fuller was his keyboard player. Some names your students probably know, like Charlie Bressler and Gene Hakes were singing in his oratorios. And it was kind of a transitional period where the instruments were modern, but the style was heading towards what we recognize as Baroque style now. This is the 60s into the 70s.
Yeah.
And then in the 70s, there was a generation of people in New York, Val Horst, Ben Peck, Phil Levin, Nancy Wilson, Linda Kwan, were getting into period instruments, and conductors not in Carnegie Hall. Well, some of them were in Carnegie Hall. There was a guy named Johannes Samari who started hiring period orchestras in the late 70s. And we did a few concerts in Carnegie in the late 70s, early 80s. One of the real mainstays was the St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue, which has a boys choir, a very fine boys choir, and they would do several concerts a year. And the conductor there was Jerry Hancock, and he started using period instruments around then. And then there were various sole proprietorships. Albert Fuller started his own group in 72 or 73, I believe, along with a lot of these festival artists people, but using period instruments, which was called Aston Magna. That was the name of the house that they all used to go to in the Berkshires in the summer. And the locals were very suspicious of these hippies from New York coming and doing heaven knows what in their community.
You were among them, weren't you?
I joined a little later, about 3 years later. Yeah. Started playing in
and Fred Rentz was another sole proprietor, wasn't he, in New York?
Fred Rentz was a sole proprietor. Jim Richmond and had started Concert Royal, not Concert Royal, but Concert Royal, it was called. And there was a pianist named Stephen Lubin who started a group called Mozartian Players. And all of these people had concert series in major venues starting in the late 70s. Alice Tully Hall, a little bit in Carnegie. Albert was in residence at the Metropolitan Museum from the late 70s on. And they would do series of 3, 4, 5 concerts a year, sometimes in churches, sometimes in halls. There wasn't so much resistance. It didn't cost so much to rent a concert hall in those days. Stagehand wages weren't quite so high. Ushers didn't cost quite so much. So people with small boards of directors could get into these major venues. And if you played in a major venue, the Times would show up, and there were some nice reviews. We put on some operas, Handel operas. Jim Richmond did some Rameau operas.
Well,
This was before Handel and Haydn went to period instruments, which was in '86. Tommy was still using modern instruments. So I lived in Boston until 1982, and at which point I was working more in New York for all these sole proprietor organizations. So we moved there in 1982.
but you continued to play for Handel and Haydn. You'd come back to Boston for the
Well,
season.
I actually didn't join Handel Haydn until they went to period instruments.
All right, which happened after you'd moved to New York.
It
Yeah.
happened after I moved to New York, and actually, Chris Hogwood's first American connection was the Mostly Mozart Festival in Lincoln Center, great performance series. It's a little hard to believe now, but for some of those years in the early to mid '80s, Chris Hogwood was the highest selling classical artist in the catalog. He sold more records than Pavarotti.
Those were the days, weren't they?
And he was bringing his group over, the Academy of Ancient Music, and having extended tours sometimes. And he thought it'd be nice to have an American group. So he hooked up with Lincoln Center and the Mostly Mozart Festival. I was involved in setting up a roster of players that could be part of that. And Stan Ritchie was the concertmaster. And we had started a wind octet called Amadeus Winds, and we were the wind section. Mostly New Yorkers, except there were Lowell Greer came in from, he was living in Michigan at the time, playing in the Detroit Symphony.
I remember really nice record of the Mozart octets. That was really nice.
Yeah, that was another nice thing that was going on through Chris Hogwood and Joshua Rifkin, who we haven't talked about yet, but we were able to make some connections with Decca Lazolier. So we recorded a bunch of Bach cantatas and the complete Mozart wind music.
So say something about the Bach Ensemble in your time with that.
Well, Tom had a lot to do with this too, actually. I think that maybe you were the one who told me about told Joshua about me.
I think so. And then we did a concert of his reconstructions.
He had reconstructed a Bach oboe concerto, and also had done a version. This had been reconstructed before, but of the D minor violin concerto, which is the first form of the famous D minor harp score. Violin concerto. So Tom, weren't you running CSEM at that point?
Oh yes, I was, right.
And Joshua was invited to put on a concert with these pieces.
Well, previously we had, or at some point, we also did a similar thing at Castle Hill.
Right, but wasn't the concerto program planned first?
I don't remember. I don't know.
Anyway, as
you were the soloist, you will remember.
Yeah, I remember that was kind of my first big concerto gig was it, and it was really hard. Well, I guess we got through it, and Robert Koff played the violin concerto, and Joshua directed, and I played the oboe concerto, and there was also Bach's arrangement of the Pergolesi Stabat Mater.
That's right.
Bach had added a viola part and certain other refinements and improvements to this Pergolesi piece. So at this point, Joshua had his ragtime career going and his Nonsuch, Schutz, and so on, kind of late Renaissance, early Baroque music career going. So connections with the record industry, and knew some people, and somehow the idea came along, well, why don't we set up a group that does one and a part vocal and instrumental Bach pieces, which Joshua, as a musicologist, had figured out was probably how they were played most, if not all of the time, at the time. So we did. We recorded these 3 Bach concertos, one and a part, and did the Magnificat for Pro Arte Records in 83, 81 with, and Cantata 210 with Judy Nelson. So
wasn't there, you didn't record, I know that he did both the B minor Mass and both Passions, but did you record those?
we recorded the B minor Mass
Right.
in late 1981. It was released in 82. And the producer, the instruments were really primitive, but fortunately the producer was a woman named Joanna Nickkrantz, who we referred to her style of producing as like the Notre Dame offense, 3 yards in a cloud of dust at a time. So, and what you would do is play until something went wrong, and then she would interrupt you, and you'd back up 2 measures and play again until something went wrong. And somehow they strung it together, and it sounded like music. But especially the brass playing, in turn, woodwinds, we didn't know much about the equipment. Brass playing, we didn't know anything about the equipment. They were really making it up as they went along, and hitting maybe 90% of the notes at the time. So that style, especially in the big choruses with trumpets, was the only way we could get through it. But the record came out, and it still holds up pretty well.
Yeah.
One singer per part. One critic called it the B minor madrigal.
Right.
And it was controversial. There was a visceral response. Choruses are supposed to be big community affairs. Tommy Dunn, who cut his chorus down to 24, was controversial enough when he'd done that 10 or 15 years earlier. But this was revolutionary around 1979.
So you're talking about the great days of people organizing a season of public concerts to which people came and sort of surviving doing that, and getting recording contracts that allowed them to, I don't know, make money and survive. What do you think? How do you think people are going to manage in today's world?
Well, a lot has evolved since then. For one thing, there are many more players who know what they're doing. So the scarcity is now of attention rather than of competent musicians, which I think is it's good because the level is much better. You don't have to record 3 measures at a time. You can actually record a concert and put it on YouTube, and there might be an odd out of tune spot, but it's and things have gotten a lot more institutionalized. These groups we have, the first real institution with a substantial board of directors and administrative staff and that sort of thing, would have been Lincoln Center, who were putting on performances. And then when Handel and Haydn took over, these were established modern instrument institutions, modern style orchestral institutions with established ways of working. Handel and Haydn goes back to 1815. And so had built up many layers of institutional memory and board members and blue bloods and people with opinions and five-figure donations, six-figure donations, that sort of thing, but also the baggage and overhead that goes along with it. So the union gets interested and starts putting up obstacles. You can't hire who you want necessarily anymore. It's so what's happened, and I think your students are probably confronting this now, is that they have to start all over in giving concerts in churches and trying to make stuff happen and build from the ground up.
So, Steve, I think times have changed. What advice would you have for musicians who are starting out nowadays in early music?
Well, I don't know. It's uh,
You were just saying people have to start where we started. Give concerts in churches, figure something out, something along those lines.
right, and then tr try to build institutions all over again. Uh, One thing that's interesting is that uh, there are early music groups, professional ones, all over the country now. And probably the worst market is in New York at this point, in terms of the supply-demand ratio. Um, Probably as much as anything because of the existence of the Juilliard program. Um, when Bruce Kovner kicked in $20 million 10 years ago or whatever it was, that kind of sucked all the oxygen out of the professional New York scene, because suddenly it was the hottest thing in town, playing at all the major halls and well funded. And so probably going somewhere else would be, and making connections somewhere else would be a smart thing to do. Um, some people who've gotten out of the program are hanging around and using New York as a base, which still can be done. I mean, I know that my work 5 years ago, which was when we started thinking about moving out here, was much less than it had been 20 years before.
Hmm.
I think that's true of almost all of my colleagues.
There was a time when really all the work there was essentially in Boston and New York, and that was all, right? It was the same people just taking the train back and forth.
Yeah, we called it the Amtrak Baroque Ensemble. And a bunch of us played in the Smithsonian group, and then there was another outpost in San Francisco, the Bay Area, with Philharmonia and American Bach soloists and that sort of thing. But now there are so many other things. What I'm finding interesting, every week it seems I hear about another professional group putting on Messiahs well before this COVID business. And really what it takes is a choir director with a church and an organ and a lot of energy and some ideas and a congregation who will come to concerts, and there's a very nice scene going in Houston now. I think they have 3 or 4 professional groups. Again, all with usually a choral conductor or keyboard player who gets them going. But if you play an instrument, they need those to do something of any size. There's a couple groups in Denver. There's a very good sounding one in Kansas City. So I guess if I were going to give career advice to your students, I would say try to create those relationships and find a potential audience that isn't already saturated, and create something that they can get excited about. You can and where they can hear Messiah for the first time, and then go on to the other, 60 Handel operas and oratorios that are equally good and wonderful, and that sort of thing, and get into find somebody who will pay for it and do it.
You make it sound so simple and pleasant, but you're right, and I'm glad to hear a lot of people are bellyaching about the decline of the record industry, concert, and here's somebody who say, it's all out there. It's just more widespread than we tend to think. It's great to hear you sound optimistic.
Well, things have definitely changed. I mean, it wouldn't happen the way it happened for us 40 years ago. You can't make it up as you go along and get paid for it. That's just so. There are. Trying to think of there was a book I was looking at about I think it might have been called "The Death of the Artist" or some gloomy title like that, where the artist has to do their own marketing and be their own social media presence and their own. Which I guess was true then in a way, but you form groups of like-minded people and find an audience somehow. There are people with millions of followers on YouTube. Making a living from it is another question. It's harder to monetize.
Somebody will figure it out. There's a lot in the future that we didn't have in the past, I guess, and it's nice to hear. It's nice to hear you sound optimistic and enthusiastic. I'm really glad. Why don't we close on a note of optimism for once?
Great.
And I want to thank you very much for this conversation, Stephen Hammer. You've taught us a lot and encouraged us a lot. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. And good luck to everyone.